Margaret Thompson had always been the type of person who blended into the background. At 52 years old, she worked as a librarian at the small public library in Cedar Falls, a quiet town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore the same style of cardigan sweaters that her mother had favored decades earlier. To most people who passed her on the street, Margaret appeared to be exactly what she seemed, a mild-mannered woman who lived a predictable, unremarkable life. Every morning, Margaret would arrive at the library 15 minutes early, unlock the heavy wooden doors, and begin her day by arranging the returned books on the counter. She moved through her routine with the precision of someone who had done the same tasks thousands of times before. The familiar smell of old books and the soft creak of the wooden floors provided a comforting soundtrack to her days. Children would come in after school. Teenagers would study for exams at the long oak tables, and elderly residents would browse the magazine section while sharing the latest town gossip. Margaret had worked at the library for nearly 30 years, ever since she moved to Cedar Falls following her divorce. The move had been a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life in a place where no one knew about her failed marriage or the dreams she had abandoned. She had chosen Cedar Falls specifically because it was unremarkable, a place where she could disappear into the rhythm of small-town life and avoid drawing attention to herself. Her colleagues at the library knew her as reliable and competent, but few knew much about her personal life. She would smile politely when they discussed their weekend plans or family gatherings, but she rarely shared details about her own activities. When asked about her hobbies, Margaret would simply say she enjoyed reading and taking quiet walks around town. What she never mentioned was how she spent many of her Saturday afternoons. The relationship with her coworkers was pleasant but superficial. During lunch breaks, while others gathered around the small table in the break room to share sandwiches and stories, Margaret usually ate alone at her desk, using the quiet time to catch up on cataloging new arrivals or updating the library's computer system. She had learned years ago that keeping to herself was easier than trying to explain the complexities of her past or the unconventional interests that occupied her free time. Margaret lived alone in a small cottage on Maple Street, a modest two-bedroom house with a garden that she tended with the same methodical care she'd brought to her work.
She see me only proud of those that she've made up happier than musicals and shoes.
The house had belonged to an elderly woman who had befriended Margaret when she first arrived in town. When the woman passed away, she had left the cottage to Margaret, recognizing in her a kindred spirit who appreciated solitude and simplicity. The neighbors knew Margaret as the quiet woman who kept her lawn neat and always waved politely when they passed on the sidewalk. Inside her home, Margaret's life was ordered and peaceful. She would prepare simple meals, tend to her plants, and spend her evenings reading by the window that overlooked her small backyard. The house reflected her personality, clean, organized, and unremarkable to casual observers. But hidden away in the basement, behind a locked door that no visitor had ever seen opened, lay evidence of a side of Margaret's life that would have shocked anyone who knew her. The basement room contained something that seemed completely at odds with the gentle librarian image that Margaret presented to the world. Carefully mounted on the walls were dozens of certificates, medals, and photographs that told a story of precision, dedication, and exceptional skill. These weren't awards for community service or library science achievements. They were trophies from a completely different world, a world where Margaret had once been known by a different name and had commanded respect and admiration from peers who understood the value of her unique talents. Margaret's journey to Cedar Falls had been motivated by more than just a desire for a fresh start after her divorce. She had been seeking an escape from a life that had become complicated by expectations and responsibilities that no longer suited her. The woman who now spent her days helping patrons find books and organizing community reading programs had once lived a life that required split-second decisions, unwavering focus, and skills that few people possessed. The transformation from her previous life to her current existence as a small-town librarian had been deliberate and complete. Margaret had consciously chosen to leave behind the recognition and excitement of her former career in favor of the anonymity and peace that Cedar Falls offered.
This is the book. It's about history and peace that Cedar Falls offered.
She had grown tired of the pressure, the constant travel, and the weight of responsibility that had defined her professional life for so many years. In Cedar Falls, Margaret could be invisible. She could go through her days without anyone expecting anything extraordinary from her. The town's residents saw her as a helpful, if unremarkable, member of their community. She served on the library board, helped organize the annual book fair, and volunteered to read to children during story time. These activities gave her a sense of purpose and connection to her adopted hometown, while requiring nothing more than the gentle, nurturing qualities that people expected from a librarian. But even in her carefully constructed new life, Margaret couldn't entirely suppress the skills and instincts that had defined her for so many years. Sometimes late at night, she would go down to her basement room and remember who she used to be. She would hold the medals and certificates, looking at photographs of a younger version of herself standing proudly among colleagues who had respected her abilities and sought her expertise. The decision to maintain her skills, even in retirement from her former life, had been a difficult one. Part of her wanted to completely abandon everything connected to her previous career and fully embrace her new identity. But another part of her recognized that the skills she had developed over decades of training and practice were not something that could simply be turned off like a switch. They were part of who she was, woven into her muscle memory and reflexes in ways that no amount of time or distance could completely erase. So Margaret had found a way to maintain her abilities while keeping them completely separate from her life in Cedar Falls. Every few months, she would drive to a neighboring county where no one knew her, spending hours at a facility where she could practice and maintain the precision that had once defined her professional life. These trips were her secret, known to no one in Cedar Falls, and she was careful to ensure that nothing about these excursions would connect back to her quiet life as the town's librarian. The people of Cedar Falls had no reason to suspect that their mild-mannered librarian possessed skills that would have impressed and surprised them. Margaret was content to let them see only what she chose to show, a woman who had found peace in books, gardens, and the simple rhythms of small-town life. She had worked hard to build this new identity, and she had no intention of allowing her past to complicate the quiet existence she had created for herself.
Margaret's days continued to follow their predictable pattern.
She would arrive at the library each morning, greet the regular patrons by name, help students with research projects, and recommend books to visitors looking for their next great read. In the afternoons, she would process new acquisitions, update card catalogs, and prepare for the evening programs that brought community members together for book discussions and author readings. The routine satisfied something in Margaret that had been missing during the chaotic years of her previous career. There was a meditative quality to the work of organizing knowledge, helping people find information, and creating a space where learning and discovery could flourish. The library had become her sanctuary, a place where she could channel her natural precision and attention to detail into work that felt meaningful and peaceful. As evening approached and Margaret prepared to close the library for another day, she moved through the building with the same careful attention she brought to everything in her life. She would check that all the computers were properly shut down, ensure that returned books were sorted for processing the next day, and verify that all the windows were securely locked. These small rituals of closure gave her a sense of completion and control that had become important to her sense of well-being. Walking home along the tree-lined streets of Cedar Falls, Margaret would occasionally reflect on the strange turns that life had taken. The woman she had been and the woman she had become seemed like two completely different people, connected only by memories and skills that she kept carefully hidden from her current world. But as she unlocked the door to her cottage and settled into another quiet evening, Margaret felt a sense of satisfaction with the choice she had made to leave her former life behind and embrace the peace that anonymity had brought her. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning, delivered to the library in a crisp white envelope addressed to Margaret Thompson. She recognized the return address immediately, though she hadn't seen it in years. The law firm of Harrison, Bradley and Associates had handled the legal affairs of her former employer, and their correspondence had once been a regular part of her professional life. Now, seeing their letterhead felt like receiving a message from a world she had deliberately left behind. Margaret waited until her lunch break to open the envelope, retreating to the privacy of her small office behind the circulation desk. The letter was formal but warm, written by James Harrison himself, a man she had known and respected during her previous career. He was writing to inform her about a memorial event being planned to honor fallen colleagues, and he was personally inviting her to attend as one of the honored veterans of their shared profession. The letter brought back a flood of memories that Margaret had worked hard to suppress. She remembered James as a serious but kind man who had handled the complex legal issues that sometimes arose in her line of work. He had always treated her with respect and professionalism, never showing the skepticism that some others had displayed when they first met her. The letter indicated that he was now the senior partner at his firm and was serving on the organizing committee for this memorial event. Margaret set the letter aside and tried to focus on the afternoon's work, but her concentration was shattered. The familiar rhythm of checking in returned books and helping patrons with research questions couldn't distract her from the emotions that the letter had stirred up. She found herself thinking about colleagues she hadn't allowed herself to remember in years, people who had shared the unique pressures and satisfactions of their demanding profession. The memorial event was scheduled for the following month at a conference center in the state capital, about a 3-hour drive from Cedar Falls. The letter explained that the ceremony would honor the memory of those who had given their lives in service to their country, and it would also serve as a reunion for surviving members of their specialized community. James had specifically mentioned that Margaret's contributions had not been forgotten, and that her presence would be deeply meaningful to those who remembered working with her. As Margaret walked home that evening, she carried the weight of an impossible decision. Attending the memorial would mean acknowledging a part of herself that she had spent years trying to bury. It would require her to face people who knew her as someone completely different from the quiet librarian she had become. The thought of explaining her current life to former colleagues filled her with anxiety, but the idea of ignoring the invitation felt like a betrayal of the friends and colleagues who deserved to be remembered and honored. That night, Margaret went down to her basement room for the first time in months. She switched on the lamp that illuminated the wall of certificates and photographs, studying the faces of people she had once worked alongside. Some of them were included in the memorial, colleagues who had paid the ultimate price for their service. Others had moved on to different careers or retired to quiet lives of their own. Looking at these reminders of her former life, Margaret felt the old sense of purpose and camaraderie that had once defined her professional identity. The photograph that drew her attention showed her standing with a team of colleagues after a particularly challenging assignment. She was younger in the picture, her hair still its natural brown color, wearing the kind of practical clothing that had been her uniform during those years. The confidence in her posture and the satisfaction in her expression seemed to belong to a different person entirely. Yet as Margaret studied the photograph, she could still remember the weight of the equipment in her hands and the intense focus that had been required to succeed in that demanding environment. Margaret spent the next several days wrestling with her decision. During quiet moments at the library, she would find herself thinking about the memorial and the people who would be gathered there. She imagined walking into a room full of former colleagues, trying to explain how the accomplished professional they remembered had transformed into a small-town librarian who spent her days recommending romance novels and helping high school students with research papers. The decision became more complicated when Margaret realized that attending the memorial might require her to confront not just her past, but also her present. Living in Cedar Falls had allowed her to avoid questions about her previous career, but facing people who had known her professionally would force her to examine whether she had truly found peace in her new life, or simply found an elaborate way to hide from who she used to be. Margaret's routine at the library continued, but her colleagues began to notice subtle changes in her demeanor. She seemed distracted during staff meetings, and her usual cheerful interactions with patrons became more mechanical. When Sarah, the young assistant librarian, asked if everything was all right, Margaret managed to smile and attributed her mood to the changing season and the busy period that always accompanied the start of the school year. The truth was that the letter had awakened something in Margaret that she hadn't expected to feel again. Despite her satisfaction with her quiet life in Cedar Falls, she realized that she missed the sense of purpose and excellence that had characterized her previous career. The memorial invitation represented more than just an opportunity to honor fallen colleagues. It was a chance to reconnect with a part of herself that she had deliberately suppressed but never entirely eliminated. As the days passed, Margaret found herself paying closer attention to news reports that related to her former field of expertise. She had spent years avoiding such stories, finding them painful reminders of a world she had left behind. Now, she felt drawn to understand how the profession had evolved since her retirement and what challenges current practitioners were facing. The knowledge that her skills and experience might still have value in that world was both exhilarating and terrifying. Margaret's evening walks through Cedar Falls began to feel different as she considered the possibility of attending the memorial. The familiar streets and friendly neighbors still provided comfort, but she also felt a growing restlessness that hadn't been present since her first years in the town. She wondered if her carefully constructed new identity had been built on a foundation of avoidance rather than genuine peace, and whether it was possible to honor her past without abandoning the life she had built.
The breakthrough came when Margaret was helping Mrs. Dadson's son, James, called Nightsea.
Patterson, an elderly patron who regularly visited the library, found a book about World War II veterans. As they talked about the courage and sacrifice of those who had served their country, Mrs. Patterson mentioned how important it was to remember and honor people who had made difficult choices in service to others.
What does this happen today?
The conversation struck Margaret with unexpected force, and she realized that her reluctance to attend the memorial was partly based on a fear of confronting her own sense of loss and regret. That evening, Margaret wrote a response to James Harrison's invitation. She explained that she was honored to be included and that she would attend the memorial ceremony. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation that she hadn't experienced in years. The decision to attend represented more than just a weekend trip. It was a choice to acknowledge that her past and present didn't have to be completely separate, and that honoring her former colleagues was more important than protecting her carefully constructed anonymity. Margaret mailed the letter the next morning and immediately began to feel the weight of what she had committed to do. She would need to take time off from the library, which would require explaining her absence to her supervisor. She would need to decide what to wear to an event that would bring together people from a world she had deliberately left behind. Do you say so? Most challenging of all, she would need to prepare herself emotionally for conversations that might force her to examine choices she had made and paths she had abandoned. The weeks leading up to the memorial passed quickly, filled with practical preparations and growing anticipation. Margaret arranged for coverage at the library, explaining to her supervisor that she was attending a memorial service for former colleagues without providing details about her previous career. Book 1, Journalist for Scheming Animation, 1992, Recognizer. A panic is there. It's a quick success. She cleaned and pressed the one formal outfit she owned that seemed appropriate for such an event, and she spent time reviewing the program that James Harrison had sent, familiarizing herself with the names of colleagues who would be honored and the schedule of events planned for the weekend. As the date of the memorial approached, Margaret found herself thinking more frequently about the skills and knowledge that had once defined her professional identity. The precision and focus that had been essential in her former career were qualities that she still possessed, even if they were now applied to organizing books and helping library patrons. She began to wonder if her decision to completely abandon her previous life had been necessary, or whether she might have found a way to maintain connections to that world while still pursuing the peace and anonymity she had sought in Cedar Falls. The night before she was scheduled to leave for the memorial, Margaret made her final preparations with the same methodical attention to detail that had always characterized her approach to important tasks. She packed carefully, choosing clothes that would allow her to feel confident and comfortable, while remaining appropriate for the solemn nature of the event. She arranged for her neighbor to collect her mail and check on her house, and she left detailed instructions for the library staff who would be covering her responsibilities while she was away. The drive to the state capitol gave Margaret time to prepare mentally for the reunion she had both anticipated and dreaded. As familiar highways gave way to urban landscapes, she felt as though she were traveling not just through space but through time, moving from the quiet identity she had built in Cedar Falls back toward a version of herself that she had carefully buried. The memorial ceremony was scheduled for the following evening, but James Harrison had organized a reception for the afternoon, giving former colleagues an opportunity to reconnect before the more formal proceedings. Margaret arrived at the hotel where many of the attendees were staying and immediately recognized the subtle signs that identified her former colleagues.
There at James Harrison.
There was something in their posture, their awareness of their surroundings, and the way they carried themselves that marked them as members of a particular community. Even in civilian clothes, years removed from active service, they retained the bearing and alertness that their training had instilled in them.
The reunion reception was held in a conference room decorated with photographs and displays honoring the careers and sacrifices of their fallen colleagues. As Margaret entered the room, she felt a complex mixture of grief, pride, and apprehension. The faces in the photographs brought back memories of missions, training exercises, and quiet conversations during downtime between assignments. These were people who had understood the unique pressures and responsibilities of their profession and who had faced those challenges with courage and skill. James Harrison spotted Margaret almost immediately and approached her with a warm smile. The years had added gray to his hair and lines to his face, but his eyes held the same intelligent kindness that Margaret remembered from their previous professional interactions. He greeted her with genuine warmth, expressing his gratitude that she had decided to attend and his eagerness to catch up on the years since they had last spoken. As they talked, Margaret was surprised to discover how easily she slipped back into the communication patterns and shared references of her former profession. James updated her on developments in their field, changes in training protocols, and technological advances that had transformed many aspects of the work they had once done together. Despite her years away from this world, Margaret found that she could still follow the technical discussions and that her insights were valued by colleagues who remembered her expertise.
Other former colleagues began to recognize Margaret and approach her with expressions of surprise and delight. Many of them had lost touch with her after she retired, and they were curious about how she had spent the intervening years. Margaret found herself in the awkward position of explaining her current life as a small-town librarian to people who remembered her.
As a consummate professional in a demanding and specialized field, the reactions to her career change varied.
Some colleagues expressed admiration for her decision to pursue a completely different path and find peace in a simpler life. Others seemed puzzled by her choice to abandon a career where she had achieved significant recognition and success. A few appeared almost uncomfortable with the idea that someone with her abilities would choose to work in such an ordinary setting, as if her decision somehow reflected poorly on the value of their shared profession.
Margaret quickly realized that explaining her transition from her former career to librarianship required more emotional energy than she had anticipated.
Each conversation forced her to articulate choices she had made instinctively and to defend decisions that she herself sometimes questioned. The process of repeatedly explaining her new life began to feel like she was trying to convince herself as much as others that she had made the right choice. During a quiet moment, Margaret stepped outside onto the hotel's terrace to gather her thoughts and process the emotions that the reunion had stirred up.
The evening air was cool, and the city lights spread out below her provided a stark contrast to the rural tranquility of Cedar Falls. As she stood alone, Margaret felt the weight of the two different worlds she was straddling, and wondered if it was possible to truly belong in both. She was joined on the terrace by Colonel Patricia Santos, a woman she had worked with extensively during some of her most challenging assignments.
Patricia had continued in their profession after Margaret's retirement and had recently been promoted to a senior leadership position.
The two women had developed a mutual respect and friendship during their years of collaboration, and Patricia had been one of the few colleagues who had understood Margaret's decision to leave when she did. Patricia's presence provided Margaret with the opportunity to have a more honest conversation about her retirement and her current life.
Unlike some of the other attendees, Patricia didn't seem surprised or disappointed by Margaret's career change. Instead, she expressed genuine interest in understanding what had motivated the transition and whether Margaret had found the peace and satisfaction she had been seeking. As they talked, Margaret found herself sharing details about her life in Cedar Falls that she hadn't planned to reveal to anyone at the reunion. She described the satisfaction she found in helping library patrons, the sense of community she had developed with the residents of her adopted town, and the peace that came from living a life free from the high-stakes pressure of their former profession.
Patricia listened without judgment, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that helped Margaret articulate feelings and motivations that she had never fully examined herself. The conversation with Patricia also allowed Margaret to acknowledge some of the challenges and losses that had accompanied her career change.
She admitted that she sometimes missed the intellectual challenges and the sense of purpose that had characterized her previous work. She also confessed that she occasionally wondered whether she had given up too much in her pursuit of anonymity and peace, and whether there might have been ways to maintain connections to their professional community while still pursuing a quieter life. Patricia shared her own experiences of the changes that had occurred in their field since Margaret's retirement. She described new challenges and opportunities, technological advances that had transformed many aspects of their work, and evolving approaches to training and deployment. As Patricia spoke, Margaret found herself engaged and interested in ways that reminded her of the intellectual satisfaction she had once derived from staying current with developments in their profession. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Patricia mentioned a consulting opportunity that had recently become available. A civilian organization was seeking someone with Margaret's particular expertise to help develop training programs and safety protocols. The work would be part-time and could potentially be done remotely, allowing someone to maintain other professional commitments while contributing their specialized knowledge to important safety initiatives. Patricia was careful to present the opportunity without pressure, making it clear that she was simply sharing information that might be of interest. She acknowledged that Margaret had built a satisfying life in Cedar Falls, and that disturbing that peace might not be worth the potential benefits of returning to their professional field, even in a limited consulting capacity. The conversation concluded with Patricia giving Margaret contact information for the organization and encouraging her to consider whether such an opportunity might fit into the life she had created.
The memorial ceremony the following evening was a powerful and emotional experience that honored the colleagues they had lost while celebrating the contributions and sacrifices of all who had served in their profession. Margaret found herself moved by the tributes and grateful for the opportunity to pay her respects to people who had meant so much to her during her active career.
The ceremony provided a sense of closure and recognition that she hadn't realized she needed. As the formal events concluded and Margaret prepared to return to Cedar Falls, she carried with her a complex mixture of emotions and new possibilities. The reunion had forced her to confront aspects of her past that she had kept buried, but it had also provided her with a renewed sense of connection to colleagues in a profession that had shaped her identity in fundamental ways. The consulting opportunity that Patricia had mentioned represented a potential bridge between her past and present, offering a way to maintain professional connections while preserving the peace and anonymity she valued in her current life. The drive back to Cedar Falls gave Margaret time to process the weekend's experiences and consider how they might influence her future choices. She had learned that her skills and expertise were still valued by former colleagues, and that there might be ways to contribute to their profession
without returning to the high-pressure environment she had deliberately left behind.
She said this next circle by its profession deliberately left behind.
The challenge would be determining whether such opportunities aligned with the goals and values that had motivated her retirement and her move to Cedar Falls. As Margaret approached the familiar surroundings of her adopted hometown, she felt a renewed appreciation for the peace and simplicity that her life there provided. David has been negotiated at the top of the jungle fencer.
The quiet streets, the predictable rhythms of small-town life, and the sanctuary of her cottage and garden represented real achievements in her pursuit of a different kind of fulfillment.
Yet the reunion had also awakened possibilities that she hadn't previously considered, suggesting that her future might include elements of both worlds rather than requiring her to choose definitively between them.
2 weeks after returning from the memorial service, Margaret found herself facing an unexpected situation that would test everything she had learned about balancing her past and present lives. It began with what seemed like a routine request from the Cedar Falls Police Department.
Chief Bradley Martinez, a man Margaret knew casually from his occasional visits to the library, called to ask if she might be available to help with a community safety presentation. Margaret's initial assumption was that the police department wanted her assistance with research or organizing materials for a public education program.
Such requests were common in her role as librarian, and she was always willing to help community organizations access information resources. However, when Chief Martinez explained the specifics of what they needed, Margaret realized that this request was far more complex than anything she had previously encountered in Cedar Falls.
The situation involved a concerning incident at the local shooting range, a facility located just outside town that served both recreational shooters and law enforcement personnel who needed to maintain their certification and training. Several witnesses had reported aggressive and potentially dangerous behavior by a group of individuals who had been using the range regularly over the past month.
The incidents had escalated to the point where other patrons felt unsafe, and there were concerns about proper safety protocols and supervision. Chief Martinez explained that his department lacked the expertise to properly evaluate the technical aspects of what had been observed at the shooting range. They needed someone with advanced knowledge of firearms safety, training protocols, and range management to assess the situation and provide recommendations for addressing the problems. He had been told by a contact in the state capitol that there might be someone in Cedar Falls with the necessary background, though he admitted he wasn't entirely clear on how that information had reached him. Margaret listened to Chief Martinez's description of the situation with growing understanding and concern.
The behaviors he described were exactly the type of safety violations and poor practices that could lead to serious accidents or create an environment where dangerous individuals might feel emboldened to act recklessly. Her professional instincts, dormant for so many years, began to activate as she processed the implications of what the chief was telling her.
The request put Margaret in an impossible position. Declining to help could mean that a dangerous situation continued to escalate, potentially putting innocent people at risk. However, agreeing to assist would require her to reveal expertise that she had kept hidden from the Cedar Falls community for years. The careful anonymity she had built would be shattered, and her quiet life as the town's librarian would never be the same.
After requesting time to consider the request, Margaret spent a sleepless night weighing her options and examining her responsibilities. She thought about the consulting opportunity that Patricia Santos had mentioned at the memorial service and wondered if this local situation might be an unexpected way to test whether she was ready to reconnect with her professional expertise.
More importantly, she considered her obligations to her adopted community and whether her unique background created a moral imperative to help address a potentially dangerous situation. The next morning, Margaret called Chief Martinez and agreed to visit the shooting range to assess the situation.
She explained that she had some relevant experience that might be helpful, though she was deliberately vague about the specifics of her background.
Margaret's arrival at the Cedar Falls shooting range marked the first time in over a decade that she had entered such a facility in a professional capacity. The familiar sounds and smells immediately transported her back to her former life, awakening muscle memory and instincts that years of quiet library work had never fully erased.
As she observed the layout of the facility and the safety protocols in place, her trained eye quickly identified several areas where improvements were needed. Chief Martinez introduced Margaret to Jake Wilson, the range's owner and primary safety officer.
Jake was a former military veteran who had opened the range 5 years earlier as a way to serve both recreational shooters and law enforcement personnel in the area.
He was clearly frustrated by the recent problems and grateful for any assistance in resolving them.
Margaret could see that Jake was competent and well-intentioned, but he lacked the advanced training needed to handle the sophisticated safety challenges that had emerged. The group that had been causing problems arrived at the range shortly after Margaret and Chief Martinez.
Margaret positioned herself where she could observe their behavior without drawing attention to herself. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the situation.
The individuals displayed a combination of poor safety practices, inadequate supervision, and concerning attitudes that created serious risks for everyone present.
Margaret watched as the group set up their equipment and began their shooting session.
Their weapon handling was technically competent but carelessly executed, with multiple violations of basic safety protocols that could have resulted in accidents. More concerning was their behavior toward other range patrons, particularly their dismissive and intimidating attitude toward less experienced shooters who were trying to use the facility for legitimate recreational purposes.
The situation reached a critical point when one member of the group began making loud, inappropriate comments about a young woman who was at the range with her father, apparently learning to shoot for the first time. The comments were both sexist and threatening, creating an atmosphere of intimidation that made other patrons visibly uncomfortable.
Margaret realized that she was witnessing exactly the type of behavior that could escalate into more serious problems if not addressed immediately. Chief Martinez looked to Margaret for guidance, clearly recognizing that the situation required expertise he didn't possess.
Margaret felt the weight of the moment and the responsibility that her unique background placed on her shoulders. The decision to intervene would mean revealing capabilities that she had kept hidden, but allowing the situation to continue could put innocent people in danger.
Margaret approached Jake Wilson and quietly explained that she needed to address the safety violations she had observed. She asked him to trust her judgment and follow her lead, promising to explain her qualifications afterward.
Jake, recognizing the expertise in her tone and demeanor, agreed to support whatever action she felt was necessary. What happened next would become the subject of stories told throughout Cedar Falls for years to come. Margaret walked onto the range with the confident bearing of someone who belonged there, her transformation from mild-mannered librarian to consummate professional so complete that even Chief Martinez was startled by the change. She approached the problematic group with calm authority and began systematically addressing their safety violations and inappropriate behavior.
The group's initial reaction was dismissive and mocking.
They saw a middle-aged woman in plain clothes and assumed she was an inexperienced shooter who had no business giving them instructions. Their leader, a man named Derek, who had been the source of most of the intimidating behavior, made several crude comments about Margaret's appearance and qualifications.
The laughter and mockery from his companions made it clear that they viewed her intervention as nothing more than an annoyance to be brushed aside. Margaret's response was to calmly request that Derek demonstrate his shooting abilities. She explained that she wanted to observe his technique before discussing safety protocols, framing the request in a way that appealed to his obvious desire to show off his skills.
Derek eagerly agreed, confident that he could intimidate this ordinary-looking woman with a display of his marksmanship.
What followed was a demonstration that revealed the difference between basic competence and true expertise. Derek's shooting was adequate for recreational purposes, but showed numerous technical flaws that became obvious once Margaret began to analyze his performance. She pointed out problems with his stance, breathing, sight alignment, and follow-through, providing specific feedback that demonstrated intimate knowledge of advanced shooting techniques. Derek's growing frustration with Margaret's critiques led him to challenge her to demonstrate her own abilities. He suggested that if she was such an expert, she should prove it by showing them how it should be done. The challenge was issued with obvious sarcasm and the expectation that Margaret would decline or embarrass herself in the attempt.
Margaret accepted the challenge with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the encounter. She approached the firing line, selected her equipment with the methodical precision of someone who had done this thousands of times before, and began what would become the most talked-about shooting demonstration in the history of Cedar Falls.